A man who almost never praised anyone said something nobody expected. In the summer of 1950, in a Double-A ballpark in Atlanta, Ty Cobb stood near the dugout rail and watched an 18-year-old swing a bat. Cobb did not travel to watch unknown players. He had not done it in years. He did it that day. When the kid sat down, Cobb spoke. He said he had only known 3 or 4 perfect swings in his life. He said the boy in front of him owned one of them. Nobody wrote it down as history. They should have. Eddie Mathews grew up in Santa Barbara, the only son responsible for a sick father and a quiet house that needed more money than it had. Baseball was not a path out. It was the only door that happened to be open. In 1949, the Boston Braves sent him to High Point Thomasville, a Class D team in the North Carolina State League. Class D sat near the bottom of organized baseball, 4 levels below the major leagues most fans had ever heard of. Players did not climb out of Class D in a single jump. They spent years there, or they disappeared from the game entirely. Mathews hit 363 inches the second half of that season. He added 17 home runs in roughly half a year of at-bats. The numbers were strange enough that the Braves moved him up 2 full levels at once, something the organization rarely did for anyone, let alone a teenager who had been playing in front of a few hundred people a night. In 1950, at 18 years old, he played Double-A ball in Atlanta and led the Crackers to a pennant. 32 home runs, 106 runs batted in. A 272 average against pitchers who had years of experience he did not have. Men who had spent entire seasons learning how to get hitters out at that level while Mathews was still learning how to shave. Scouts noticed the power first. It was easy to notice. The ball traveled distances that made veteran pitchers stop and stare at the outfield wall instead of walking back to the mound. Coaches noticed the discipline second. The way he waited on a pitch instead of chasing it. The way he let bad pitches pass without flinching, even as a teenager surrounded by grown men. Then Ty Cobb noticed something else. Something that did not show up in a box score. He noticed the swing itself. Not the result of the swing. Not where the ball landed. The motion before contact. The part almost nobody in the stands was trained to watch. Nobody in that ballpark that day knew they were watching the early proof of something that would not be fully understood for almost 25 years, something that would sit quietly in a single sentence until the rest of the sport finally caught up to it. By January of 1974, Eddie Mathews had retired with 512 home runs, a number only 6 men in the history of the sport had ever reached before him. He had 12 All-Star selections. He had a World Series ring from 1957 and another from 1968. He had spent 17 seasons doing the one thing a third baseman almost never did at that volume, hitting the ball over the fence with the kind of consistency that most sluggers at easier positions never managed. The writers who voted on the Hall of Fame that year were not careless men. Many of them had covered the game for decades, watched thousands of games, built entire careers on knowing the difference between a good player and a great one. Their case against Mathews was simple and, on the surface, reasonable. His career batting average sat at 271, low for a player remembered primarily as a slugger. The 1,974 ballot was crowded with strong candidates, and voters had limited space on their 10-man ballots. Power numbers alone, several writers argued, did not make a player great. Consistency at the plate mattered just as much, they said, maybe more. There was truth in that argument. Mathews was never a high-average hitter. He struck out often, sometimes badly, sometimes in ways that frustrated his own manager. He was, by his own admission, a player built for one specific kind of damage rather than a complete offensive package. But the writers were measuring him against the wrong standard. They were comparing him to outfielders and first basemen who built their reputations purely on hitting, men who never had to worry about diving for a ground ball between pitches. Mathews played third base, the most physically demanding position on the dirt, and somehow did it while setting a power record that would stand for 33 years. Mathews finished 9th in the voting that January. Less than a third of the writers checked his name. One man, 24 years earlier, had already settled the argument they were still having. Ty Cobb did not explain himself to reporters in 1950, and reporters did not ask, because none of them even knew he had gone anywhere. There was no press conference, no, quote, release to wire services, no photographer waiting by the dugout to capture the moment for tomorrow's paper. A man widely regarded as the most difficult, most demanding hitter the sport had ever produced simply got into a car on his own, drove to a minor league park most scouts would not have bothered visiting, and watched a teenager he had never met play a single afternoon of baseball. He did not stay afterward to give instruction. He did not pull the boy aside and offer advice the way older players sometimes did when they spotted talent worth shaping. He did not return the following week to confirm what he thought he had seen. He said one thing, briefly, and then he left, the way a man leaves a room once he has already said everything that actually mattered to him and feels no need to repeat it. The reason Cobb could see it before almost anyone else had nothing to do with luck or coincidence. Cobb himself had arrived in the major leagues as a teenager from rural Georgia, dismissed early by veteran players who thought his swing looked too aggressive, too unconventional, too likely to fall apart against better pitching. They had been completely wrong about him, and he never forgot what that felt like. He remembered the particular sting of being measured by men who had already decided the answer before they ever bothered watching closely, the same mistake an entire generation of Hall of Fame voters would later make with the boy standing in front of him. He also understood something most scouts in that ballpark did not: the difference between a swing built for one good season and a swing built to repeat itself for 20 years without breaking down under pressure. Most observers could describe raw power well enough. They could point at a long home run and call it impressive, the way casual fans always did. Far fewer of them could describe repeatability, the quiet mechanical truth underneath the surface that separates a brief hot streak from an actual career spent at the highest level. Mathews had the second kind, and Cobb recognized it almost instantly because he had spent his own career proving the first kind of judgment wrong. Swing after swing, season after season, long after people had quietly expected him to slow down and fade into the background. There was no ceremony in what Cobb did that day, no grand gesture, no speech meant to be remembered, no crowd gathered around him afterward asking what he thought. Just one man, already certain of his own legacy, choosing to spend a quiet afternoon watching somebody else's beginning instead of resting comfortably on his own. It cost him nothing to be there, nothing but a few hours and a tank of gasoline. It would have cost the sport something real if nobody standing nearby had bothered to remember it. Did you ever watch someone do something so naturally right that you knew, before anyone else around you noticed, that they were different? Tell us in the comments. On the night of the 16th of January, 1974, Eddie Mathews learned that he had finished 9th in Hall of Fame voting. He was not at home when the call came. He found a phone somewhere nearby and called his wife instead, the way a man calls the one person he does not have to perform anything for. There was no public statement that night, no angry interview the next morning. Nothing handed to the writers who had just passed him over, even though he had every reason to say something. Teammates who knew him well were not surprised by the silence. Eddie Mathews had always absorbed disappointment quietly and kept it somewhere private, the way some men keep a wound covered so nobody else has to look at it or ask about it. He did not perform pain for an audience. He carried it home instead, where nobody outside his own family would ever see what it actually cost him. Johnny Logan, who played alongside him in Boston and Milwaukee, later called him a fighting partner, the kind of teammate who finished arguments Logan started in bars and clubhouses across the league. People who only knew that side of Mathews pictured someone loud, someone who would have stormed out of the ballpark after a snub like this one. The men who actually played beside him knew a different version. They described long stretches of silence after a tough loss, a habit of sitting alone near his locker long after the other players had showered and gone home, staring at nothing in particular until someone finally turned off the lights. That same quiet ran in both directions. Ty Cobb never spoke publicly about the 1,950 afternoon in Atlanta again. He did not write about it in any of the memoirs and interviews that followed him into old age. He did not mention it, even when reporters specifically asked him to name the best young players he had ever watched play, a question he answered more than once before he died. Whatever he saw that day, he kept it to himself almost completely, the same way Mathews would later keep his own disappointment to himself. The only reason the moment survives at all is because a small handful of people standing near that Atlanta dugout remembered it well enough to repeat it to others, who eventually repeated it again, until somebody finally wrote it down decades later. Without those few witnesses, the story would have disappeared as completely as thousands of other minor league afternoons that nobody bothered to record. A prediction that nearly vanished into nothing. A disappointment that nearly went unspoken forever. Two private moments, separated by 24 years and hundreds of miles, that together explain a story most fans only know in scattered pieces, if they know it at all. This is the part of Eddie Mathews most people never hear about, the part that happened away from any camera or microphone, in a car ride nobody bothered to record, and a phone call nobody else was listening to. It is also the part that explains everything else. Not the home runs, not the record book. The two men who quietly decided, each in his own way, that some things did not need to be said out loud to be true. In 1953, Eddie Mathews hit 47 home runs. No third baseman in the history of the major leagues had ever hit that many in a single season, not even close. The record stood for 33 years, untouched by anyone who tried to play the same position, until Mike Schmidt finally passed it in 1980. 33 years is not a streak or a stretch of good luck. It is closer to a generation, long enough for entire careers to begin and end while the number stayed exactly where Mathews left it, ignored by most of the sport that should have been talking about it constantly. By the time he retired in 1968, Mathews had 512 home runs, placing him 7th on the all-time list at that point, behind only Babe Ruth, Jimmy Fox, Mel Ott, Ted Williams, Willie Mays, and Mickey Mantle. Every other name on that list is remembered today as one of the greatest hitters who ever lived, spoken about constantly, studied in books and documentaries. Mathews, for 5 full years, was not even considered worthy of induction by the men whose entire job was to make that decision correctly. Then, there is the number that connects him directly to the teammate who eventually passed him on that same list. Mathews and Hank Aaron, playing side by side in Milwaukee for 9 seasons, combined for 863 home runs as teammates, the most ever produced by 2 players wearing the same uniform at the same time. Only Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig come anywhere close, and even that legendary pairing falls short of the total these 2 men quietly built together. Aaron arrived in Milwaukee 2 years after Mathews and learned from watching him every single day, the same patient way Mathews himself had once learned from older players willing to show him something useful. Mathews never publicly complained about being overshadowed by the younger man he had mentored without ever once using that word out loud. Not in interviews, not to teammates, not even to his own family as far as anyone could tell. He simply kept playing third base the way he always had, the exact way Ty Cobb noticed first, long before anyone else in baseball thought to look closely enough. There is something almost cruel about how these numbers lined up against him. A record that lasted longer than most careers. A ranking that placed him among legends everyone still talks about today. A partnership with Aaron that produced more combined power than any 2 teammates in the history of the sport. And still, in 1974, none of it was enough to convince a room full of voters who had access to every one of these facts and chose to look past them anyway. The numbers were never the problem. They were sitting right there, in plain sight, year after year, waiting for someone to add them up correctly the way Ty Cobb already had, decades earlier, without needing a single calculator or box score to tell him what he was already watching with his own eyes. Do you think the voters were right to make him wait, or was this one of the real mistakes in Hall of Fame history? Let us know below. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being correct before the world is ready to agree with you. Ty Cobb experienced almost none of that loneliness himself. He was already famous when he made his prediction, already untouchable in the eyes of the sport. His reputation did not depend on whether anyone believed him about a teenager in Atlanta nobody had ever heard of. Eddie Mathews carried the opposite burden. He had to live inside the gap between what Cobb saw in 1950 and what the voters refused to see in 1974. For 5 winters, he watched players he had outperformed get inducted while his own name sat near the bottom of the ballot, year after year, with no clear explanation ever offered to him directly. He never demanded one. He never gave one either, choosing instead to let the silence speak for itself. What would have happened if Cobb had stayed quiet that afternoon, the way he stayed quiet about almost everything else in his later years? The moment would have disappeared completely, swallowed by decades and faulty memory, leaving nothing behind except a record book that strangers would eventually study without context, without ever knowing someone had already settled the question before it was even asked. Instead, a small handful of witnesses kept the story alive long enough for it to resurface, fragment by fragment, until it became something close to proof that the writers had simply missed what was always there, sitting in plain sight on a AA field in Georgia. The question that remains is not whether Mathews deserved more credit sooner. The question is, how many other players never had a Ty Cobb standing nearby to say it out loud? In 1978, on his fifth try, Eddie Mathews was finally elected to the Hall of Fame with 79.4% of the vote, comfortably above the threshold required. The wait was over. The record was finally official, printed and bronzed and settled for good. But the truer verdict had already been delivered in 1950, in a ballpark most baseball fans have never heard of, by a man who almost never gave anyone that kind of praise. Ty Cobb did not need 5 years of statistics to know what he was looking at. He needed one swing, watched for a few seconds, on an afternoon nobody thought to write about. History eventually caught up to what Cobb already understood. It always does, eventually, even when it takes far longer than it should. The 33-year home run record stayed unbroken long after both men were gone from the game. The 863 combined home runs with Hank Aaron remain unmatched by any other teammate pairing in the sport, a number that belongs to both men equally and to neither one alone. Sometimes the hardest part of being right is waiting for everyone else to catch up, year after year, while the proof sits quietly in plain sight. If this story stayed with you, leave a like. It tells us to keep going deeper into the player's history almost forgot. Drop a comment with the name of a player you think deserved more credit sooner than he got it. Share this with someone who loves the game. And if you want to see the story of Hank Aaron next, that video is waiting.